Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lawrence Gianangeli. Andiamo avanti. Renaissance people, welcome back to the continuation of our interview series. Before I introduce our guest today, I just want to say that this is the first time we're going to do an interview in two parts. So for the beginning, we're going to discuss who these followers of Raphael are, what ecocritical art history is, and what our guest, Esme Garlake, what her approach is to studying the Renaissance via ecocriticism or ecocritical art history. Okay, so we're going to start with Giulio Romano, the approach overall, and ultimately his frescoes in Palazzo Te in Mantua. And in the second part, we're going to get more into Giovanni da Udine and the Villa Farnesina in Rome. Renaissance people, I am so excited to welcome Esme Garlake on the show today, and we are going to be discussing the artworks of Giovanni da Udine and Giulio Romano. These are followers of Raphael, and we're specifically going to be looking at Esme's critical approach to art history, that is eco-criticism, and how she applies that to the Renaissance. So Esme Garlake, she's an art historian and climate activist. She's earned her bachelor's in arts in Spanish and Italian at the University of Cambridge. I saw MA and started to say Cambridge, Massachusetts.
I didn't know that.
No, and a master's degree in the history of art, specializing in the Italian Renaissance at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. Esme has recently started a PhD in the history of art department at University College London, focusing on early 16th century Italian art through an eco-critical lens. Esme is also involved in grassroots groups campaigning for climate justice, including Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, and Fossil-Free London. Esme, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
So let's kick things off in simple terms. We're discussing two artists of the High Renaissance, and we're going to dive into eco-critical art history as an approach to analyzing art and how that can be applied specifically in the context of Renaissance art. Esme, can you provide us with a brief overview of Giovanni da Udine and Giulio Romano and the works that we're going to be discussing today, please?
Yeah, of course. So these two artists both worked in Raphael's workshop in the 1510s. But they had quite different roles. So Giulio Romano was slightly younger, and he was born in Rome. And he started his artistic career through Raphael's workshop. He was an apprentice there, and he actually became one of the two heirs to Raphael's workshop when he died in 1520. And he's kind of follows Raphael much more closely in some senses. Giovanni da Udine was from Veneto in northern Italy. When he came to Rome in the 1510s, he was a more established artist already. So he joined Raphael's workshop as the specialist in painting nature and birds and animals. So they both worked on the same commissions, which we're going to talk about. So some frescoes in the Vatican and in particular the Villa Farnesina in Rome. And yeah, they both. So Giovanni da Udine he was kind of applied to doing the borders and the vegetation and the animals. Giulio Romano much more was helping Raphael with the figures.
Do you want to take us through some of these works?
Yeah, so I think I feel before we start going into them, just probably need to say kind of my own approach about the eco-criticism, because I focused during my master's on these two artists, but I was looking at them through what I would now say is an eco-critical perspective, and as a general kind of definition, as it will become clearer as we go, but I'm looking at these two artists thinking about what their artworks can tell us about human relationships with the natural world and with animals and plants. And as you'll see, it opens up quite a few questions which we may not have asked if we weren't thinking about this part of things. So Yeah, so I mean, I think it's important to think about the animals that were actually existing in Rome at this time. They weren't just dogs and cats and birds, but they were also animals like this Hanno the elephant. I don't know if you know Hanno the elephant, Lawrence.
I think I've come across them when I was doing a little bit of work on Lorenzo de Medici's giraffe, but I don't think I know Hanno's story.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting because there are these kind of individual animals that stand out in the Renaissance in this particular period, and we know about them through artworks. And part of that is because the patrons or, the owners of these animals wanted them to be memorialized in art to show off partly the fact that they had access to these animals, which represent, I mean, it's kind of like a fancy car today. It's like a big status symbol.
Right.
So Hanno the elephant came over. I think he was a diplomatic gift from, I think it was the King of Portugal. I may be wrong, but he came over, gifted to Leo the 10th, the Pope Leo the 10th, and he only lived for 2 more years. So he came to Rome in 1516 and was in a procession through the streets, and he only lived a couple more years because I think he was accidentally, they fed him gold or they fed him something that poisoned him. But he was apparently beloved by Leo the 10th. And this image was done by Raphael, and it's really interesting to have a look at how we might think about an image of an animal from early 16th century Italy, because you can see that it's first of all really realistic. I mean, look, that there are the hairs on the elephant's head, the wrinkles. He has really captured all the wrinkles and the textures of the elephant's skin. But the elephant also has a bell around its neck. It has a handler on top and one to the side on the ground. So this really is a domesticated animal. Yeah.
So I imagine not me, maybe you can actually identify what type of elephant this is based on the rendering.
Yes, absolutely. So this would be an Indian elephant, this one, because it has tiny ears.
Right.
So yeah, and yeah, I mean, it's interesting because this was a period when Raphael was one of the first artists who was using human life models to draw his figures, and life drawing as we would today think of it. And so animals were also involved in this, in the sense Raphael didn't do it so much. He mainly painted and depicted human figures. But the reason I was interested in showing this image first is to see how artists at this time were increasingly valuing naturalism in their art. So being really realistic about animals. Often we think of that as being a kind of progressive element. So as we'll see, it's not just we as art historians we can celebrate that as an element of the start of kind of empirical observation and scientific knowledge, which it is certainly, but also important to recognize that these artists have access to these animals through often very troubling kind of power dynamics. So again, like thinking about these animals as real beings who actually experienced quite a lot of hardship.
So what I have here next is that really important is, I think, your approach, because ecocritical art history in the Renaissance is pretty novel, right? There's not a large body of work on this, and there's not a large number of experts in this field. So, that it's extremely important that you're doing this work, but also, how are you doing this work? Can you define ecocritical art history and how that's being linked to the Renaissance?
For sure. I think it's important to see eco-critical art history or one thing that has helped me explain it to people has been to think about it in parallel to feminist art history. So that feminism, as we know it, that's a 20th century phenomenon. It's a modern phenomenon. But we, as art historians, now feel quite comfortable applying it to pretty much any art historical period. Because it's about asking questions about gender, about sexuality, about the historical status of women, and power dynamics, crucially, in societies. And so the way I try and think about eco-critical art history is, in a similar way, we are currently in a time when questions of environmental catastrophe and environmental instability are right at the forefront of our modern experiences. And that requires that we think back on history with a new kind of lens that thinks about human histories of interactions with and exploitation of the natural world and animals. So the key point I guess to make at this stage is that it's very open. It's far more about asking questions at this stage, which is very exciting. But also it's about remembering that it doesn't have that the artwork that we're looking at does not have to explicitly engage with, per se, the environment or climate change. A lot of eco-critical art historians are doing amazing work at thinking about environments, in this period or earlier or later. I'm personally more interested in thinking more about how art plays into perceptions at the time in early 16th century Italy of animals, of the world around, even not just natural world, but the urban environments, things like that.
So, I mean, it only has a little bit to do, from what I'm understanding, with the actual types of naturalism in depiction. Like you said, Raphael is depicting from live models. It's not that type of naturalism, but actually the interaction between the imagery of the natural world and the artist.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show.
Yes, and the artist and how it's received. So I think I have my MA focusing on Giulio Romano and Giovanni da Udine was thinking quite a lot about, it was really centering the artist. And I think that while that is useful, I now am taking more of an approach of let's use these artworks to think about receptions, like to think about how those artworks were functioning for people, to kind of build people's views of the natural world at the time, and to view and to build views of human dominance over the natural world as well. So, I mean, the image that we have now is Giulio Romano's horses room at Sala dei Cavalli in Palazzo Te in Mantua, which again I would urge anyone to go and see if they are in Italy. It's an amazing palazzo in Mantua, and Giulio Romano did this a few years. He started work on it around 1524 when he arrived in Mantua from Raphael's workshop. And this room it's filled with frescoes, but the naturalistic depictions of his patrons' horses are fascinating, and they're fascinating for art historians thinking about so many things, but from an eco-critical perspective, they're a really great example of an artist who is capturing these animals so naturalistically, so realistically, and one of the horses is actually looking down with an open eye, as if we've kind of startled it. I would say this is an example of, you know, these are thoroughbred horses. They are, again, status symbols. We as art historians, I think from a perspective of today, where, you know, we still have horse racing, we still use and abuse animals, you know, on an industrial scale, I think it helps us to look at these animals and think, right, here's an artist projecting a view of these animals as objects, a view of these animals as there for our consumption, both visually and literally.
You know, this is such an interesting fresco in that, do you happen to know off the top of your head, this is Palazzo Te, Mantua, is that whose palace it was?
Oh yeah, it's Federico Gonzaga's.
Gonzaga.
Yeah, it's a Gonzaga. It was a suburban palace, yeah.
Right, Gonzaga, of course. You know, for listeners, what we essentially are looking at on our screen here are two highly naturalistic horses standing above eye level, like well above the fireplace, but in the center of the composition is a sculptural human form. Looks like some kind of philosopher figure or something of the like, but it's really not. It's not a stylized version of these horses. They are naturalistically rendered as close as possible, and maybe has something to do with like power and patronage of the family itself, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, these particular breeds as well. There has been there are quite a few studies now about the breeding of horses in the Gonzaga court, and this was a passion of Federico Gonzaga's. It's very much, you know, art historians can see straight away that this is about status and power. I think what's interesting to note as well was the kind of the showing off that Giulio Romano is doing. He is showing these horses, they're life size. They are individual horses. So the Duke Federico Gonzaga knew each horse. It's a kind of pet portrait in a way. It's the Renaissance pet portrait. But also it's interesting to note the kind of classical references that this naturalism has. So thinking about I always pronounce his name wrong, but Pliny the Elder.
I say Pliny, but
Pliny. Okay, let's do that. It's when you spend all your time reading the word and you don't say it out loud. But Pliny the Elder, the Roman author, in his natural history book, which had a big influence on artists at this time, he writes about a Greek painter who painted grapes so realistically that birds flew up to the painting and tried to pluck them. And so Giulio Romano here, just like Giovanni da Udine and Raphael and many others at this time, they are really also declaring their intellectual knowledge, and they're aligning themselves with these ancient painters through naturalism.
That would have to be Apelles, was it? Do you know?
It was do you know, I think he had another thing like that, but this was
Zeuxis.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Again, another Greek Roman. Like
so how many horses actually make up this room? I imagine
I think it's 8. Yeah, and there's a book that's just come out recently, and this is a historian's book. I cannot remember her name. It's Cooley. Her surname is Cooley, an American scholar, about race and breeding of animals in the Italian Renaissance, and then she compares it with colonial settlements in Southern America. So kind of the idea and the history of race and breeding, and razza, the word for race, which was used in animal breeding first. So there's, again, I think there's a lot of social history in eco-critical art history.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's I was going to mention that, but I didn't want to belabor the point too much. But I always tell my listeners to read Michael Baxendale, and this is social history, but it's also understanding what a viewer in the 16th century would see when they looked at these horses. And I'm imagining they would see this sort of idea of pedigree, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I could not see in a horse. I could not tell one horse from another in a painting, but viewers in the Palazzo Te in the 16th century would immediately recognize the implications of this specific type of representation for the horses.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. So I think also it's interesting to compare the kind of hyper realism of these horses with a room next to it, which is these huge, it's my favorite room in the Palazzo Te. It's a room filled with classical figures. Lawrence, you're probably better at describing for listeners what this screen, if you want to go.
Yeah, so dear listeners, we're looking at what is called the matrimonio di amore e Psyche, or the marriage of Amore and Psyche, in the Palazzo Te, Mantua, by Giulio Romano. So be sure to pull that up. And it's a fresco. It has these sort of architectural like embellishments in the arches. Kind of looks, actually, it makes me think of what Veronese is going to do when he puts his biblical scenes to these series of 3 arches. We have, it looks like a classical scene. It's kind of Bacchic, I suppose, with the
Bacchus is definitely in there. He's actually leaning on the table.
There he is. And right below him, what is going on here? We have
so this is a crazy room. This has, when you go in, and because this is actually above eye level, so you look up and it is I would say it's like an early 16th century kind of party going on. It's really raucous. There's a lot of drinking and half human, half animal people. The reason I kind of wanted to just, we don't need to stay on this for a long time, but looking at this image, there are a lot of animals in it. So we have an elephant in the background, a camel, a donkey. We also have 2 tigers on the floor, and they have these really kind of swollen teats. But the reason it's really interesting is I'm interested in how animals have this language of, they can be hyper realistic. They can also be very, they can be symbolic, which I think art historians can kind of get a bit more, but they can also be very funny in a kind of quite bawdy. Giulio Romano is really having a joke here in quite across this whole room, really, about it's full of sex and full of drunkenness. And so these tigers, I just think a really good example of they're naturalistic, but they're also kind of bawdy and a bit kind of sexualized, strangely.
This is actually the first time I think that I've ever seen tigers in Renaissance painting off the top of my head. They're not a common motif at all. Lions, yes. Tigers, not so much.
Yeah. And also, again, you've got this mix of, okay, it's doing something kind of, it's classical, it's indicating something classical, it's indicating something funny, because Federico Gonzaga apparently is quite a partier as well. So he liked his women and things like that. So this is kind of reference, it's gonna amuse him. But also you have, well, these are tigers. This is an artist who has access to tigers, or at least kind of is showing that this is a place that has access to exotic animals. So yeah, it's always kind of, I would say, looking at something like this, not just saying, oh, this is symbolizing, Bacchus or symbolizing a party, but no, let's actually think about how is the artist making this? How is the artist accessing So they don't always access it from life as well. So sometimes, so you can see the elephant here. At the start, it kind of images are recycled of animals. The famous one is Dürer's rhinoceros, which famously Dürer did not actually see. He went off a written description,
which I think you can tell when you look at that.
You can if you actually compare it to a real rhino. Yeah, absolutely.
Have you seen? This has to be my favorite imagined animal. It's Baroque. I don't know what your background in Baroque art is, but Bernini's Four Rivers Fountain in Piazza Navona in Rome.
No.
Either for the Nile or for the Amazon, he does a crocodile, but it is not a crocodile. Like it is, but he's I'll post that probably too on the Instagram with Dürer's rhinoceros, but I'll send that to you.
Yeah, it's fascinating because we have this idea that, you know, by the 16th century, you've got artists like Dürer and Raphael, and, you know, Leonardo even before, being so, they observe the natural world so closely that actually it's never as simple as that. It really, imagination always comes into it.
And it seems like there's a type of like hierarchy being presented here, maybe based on actual geographic knowledge of animals. It's like a simultaneous recognition of like local and indigenous court power by having non-local and indigenous animal species. Yeah. So you have camel and elephant and tiger, but you also have these goats. And do you see this? Is that a duck on the plates there?
Yeah, so that is it's actually a vessel for, you know, I think it's a drinking vessel. So it's not actually a duck.
Piece of porcelain.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another fascinating thing about this is, you know, the way that animals, they're really blurred between being real animals and objects or vessels, or, you know, they're being used for so that's well spotted. The duck is an amusing thing. And actually, while we're on that, Giulio Romano, he was free basically. He was the court artist in Mantua, and he let his imagination run wild. So he designed the architecture for the palazzo. He did the frescoes, but he also was designing tableware and silverware for Federico Gonzaga and for his banquets. So, and they had an amazing exhibition actually last year earlier this year, where the curators actually remade some of the vessels, some of the designs.
Wow.
Using 3D printing. I think it's very cool. But he uses here's an example. So most of the tableware is now lost, but we have his designs for it, and he uses animal imagery constantly in it as an imaginative tool. So we're looking at prongs here that are made out of, well, they're imagined as a duck's beak.
Yeah, this is very interesting for our listeners. I mean, it's a prongs, that's what we call it, for like serving food or something. It does not really look practical though. Do you know if they actually made one of these, or is this just an example of his drawings that you're showing?
We don't know if he actually made one of these. I'm not sure if they did in the exhibition, but he was famously over the top with his designs. So actually, one of the first designs that he made, he employed an artisan in Rome to turn the design into life, and the person in Rome said, "That's the last time I'm doing this for you, because you paid me too little and it took way too long and it was way too complicated and not worth it." But he, you know, I mean, I think we're fairly familiar with decorations even from medieval times and classical times, using animals as decorations, particularly in the margins, and kind of blurring leaves with animal bodies and things like that. Here, Giulio Romano, really, he's combining a kind of naturalism with an imagination, and that's fascinating. But it also, I would argue, it kind of again reinforces a view, or it's reflecting a view of animals as being there as objects. Yeah, and I suppose that's a kind of quite cynical view in a way, but again, important in the context of, this is a period where this is just at the beginning of colonial expansion abroad, and the colonies are really growing. And so thinking about kind of the worldview is shifting in this period.
Right. And I think about trying to relate to early modern people. Sometimes, I personally contest the idea that we're all the same everywhere in the world and we've always been the same. That is very far from the truth for me. In the very least, there is often this sort of bond between human and animals that I think appears and does manifest either symbolically or otherwise in Renaissance art. But then that's also contrasted with this animal, which the drawing doesn't look like it's based on the design of an animal. It looks like it's based off of the physical anatomical parts of this bird, right?
Exactly.
There's like a real, is not the snakes. The snakes look like they'd be decorative, but the bird head looks like drawn from life, or referencing some sort of drawing that drew from life. So the actual like reuse of animal parts, or the sort of a status signifier of animals versus companionship, I think is an interesting distinction.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to think about when we're thinking about access to animals, for the artists, but also for people who are seeing these artworks at the time, thinking about how actually people were probably living in much closer proximity to animals than we are today, at least if we live in cities.
Right.
It's not necessarily that Giulio Romano would have been spending lots of time focusing on drawing ducks. He actually wasn't particularly interested in drawing. He was the kind of really letting his imagination go. And we'll see Giovanni da Udine clearly spent time observing animals. But nonetheless, ducks, geese, chickens would have been around.
Right.
And I think it's important to also emphasize, this is about accessing animals and treating them like objects. Yes. But also, the world was extremely different this is a pre-industrial world where farming is generally not done on a massive scale, so quite good to recognize again, like the differences in that.
Renaissance people, that was the conclusion of the first half of my conversation with Esme Garlake, which was exceptional. Coming next is going to be our discussion of Giovanni da Udine and the Villa Farnesina, as well as the recent climate protests that have been taking place inside of museums. Stay tuned, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and check out our Patreon. Until next time, my dear listeners, arrivederci.